Good evening and welcome to our viewers here in Denmark, and good afternoon and especially welcome to you, Branko Milanovic. I believe you're in New York, isn't that correct?
Thank you very much, Rune. It's a pleasure to be there, as it were. I'm actually in Washington, D.C., so not far from New York, but it's a little bit more pleasant here because it's greener.
Well, thank you so much. You've been very important for our newspaper. Your book about global inequality has been a point of reference for us, as it has been for a lot of other people, both in understanding the forces driving inequality, but also showing us how what we perceive as a disaster in our part of the world is actually beneficial other places in the world. So it gives us a more mixed picture of the blessings and the curses of globalization. It's been a very, very important book. The only negative thing I can say about it is that it always invites me to make some really bad jokes about the elephant man and the elephant in the room, but I will refrain from that because you heard it a lot of times. Thank you so much for taking your time with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very kind of you to say so about the book. You know, it does, just if I may say a few words on that, it does actually show how we are a little bit, how should I say, overly influenced by what is obviously happening in the rich world. But you know, the rich world, particularly in terms of population, is now getting smaller. So it's not the entire world. We often actually tend to overestimate what's happening to us and believe that the same thing must be happening elsewhere.
Yeah, I'll get back to that later, because I think there's a very interesting dilemma for the left here, that if you make progressive protectionism in our part of the world, in order to ensure the wages and the jobs for your own working class, it might not be as good for the global south as you would expect. I'll get back to that. I think it's a very interesting dilemma. But I want to start off with a point in your latest book, which is absolutely wonderful, Capitalism Alone. I can recommend it to everyone. It's a wonderful book. You say that capitalism is now the globally dominant ideology and political system, the only one left, and there is no alternative. There's just varieties of capitalism, which you explore in the book. But I was thinking, you have the rare, which must now be a kind of historical privilege, to grow up in a society that wasn't capitalist. You grew up in Tito's Yugoslavia. And I was wondering, I would love to hear you now saying, what did you think of capitalism when you were growing up in a country that wasn't capitalist and that was something abroad for you?
Ron, that's a very good question. It is true, I think, that there is an advantage of having had different experiences, simply because they push you to look at things from slightly different angle. Now, you asked me a difficult question. I have really to remember exactly what I thought when I was, I suppose, 17 or 21 or so on. I would say there were several maybe somewhat contradictory things. First, I was very much influenced by Marxism. And when you study Marx in the beginning of your economics classes, I have to say that it always remains for you. It's a little bit like a religion, you know, because it has this grandiose view of the economics as explaining the fate of mankind. And when you start studying neoclassical economics, or the economics that are studied now, you are totally disappointed. You know, you see these people studying what is the cost of a bottle of water, you know, are the chairs more expensive than tables? And you think, I mean, what is this? You know, we actually want to study how the humankind is going to evolve, what will be infrastructure, superstructure, how, you know, ideology is going to be shaped by these relations of production. So there is always this disappointment. So that's actually one thing. Secondly, on the negative side, there are two things which I think were obvious to me and to most of my friends at that time. First of all, that capitalist societies were democratic societies, and societies in which we grew up were not. They, of course, varied. You know, certainly the Soviet Union was not the same as Albania. Albania was not the same as Yugoslavia. You know, Yugoslavia was an open country, and actually the support for Tito's regime was very strong. But nevertheless, we knew there was actually limits to what you could say, and you had no political parties. So that was a negative thing. And another one which was negative was essentially that economic development was higher in capitalist countries, partly because of historical reasons, but partly I would say because from the late 60s, and people have studied that since, there was a slowdown in growth in socialist countries. So the gap between the more developed capitalist countries in Europe and socialist countries increased.
So it's not just a historical prejudice on my part to imagine that you thought that capitalist countries were more free and more prosperous.
I thought so, actually, but you know, it is very difficult to generalize, because I had friends, I have to say that, who were from different political angles. First of all, Yugoslavia, as you know, as we found out afterwards with the Civil War, was very divided ethnically. So everybody basically thought, a little bit like the European Union today, everybody thought that actually somebody else is exploiting them. So, you know, so there was this sort of axis of disappointment, which had nothing to do necessarily with the regime, but it had to do with, you know, sort of ethnic constituencies. And then also I had friends who were very much on the sort of Stalinist left. And then I had friends and who remained actually for their whole life very liberal. So, you know, I was somewhere in between, because my view, I have to say, was social democratic from the beginning. So the Stalinist friends always used to give me lots of grief. On the other hand, they were impressed with my knowledge of Marxist or communist history. So then that would actually play in my favor.
So when was the first time that you came to a capitalist country, and what was that like?
Well, I was relatively, excuse me, I was relatively young, because I did my high school in Belgium. So that was in, you know, I was like 14 when I came to Belgium. So that was, I was young. But one thing which actually I noticed in Belgium, in my class, I was in a public school, that it was in terms of class stratification much more stratified than our class in Belgrade. You know, you actually, and when we started, maybe 17, 18, people started dating each other and so on. It was very stratified in the sense that the kids whose parents were, and we knew that whose parent, you know, lawyers or doctors were actually dating each other. So, and the parties were also stratified. Until the last year of high school, when it became, I think, because, you know, people are then young, and that was the time of the, you know, sexual and otherwise revolutions in the, you know, in the early 70s. Then this stratification, I think, actually kind of collapsed, and the university already days were different. So, but that was my impression in the high school.
Oh, that's very interesting. Then you worked for, I believe, a couple of decades as director of the IMF. And I must admit here that we've been very critical of IMF at this newspaper. And we've...
Well, I have to say that it was actually the World Bank, and I was not such a top directors that you mentioned. I simply worked as a lead economist in the research department. But you know, whether it is IMF or the World Bank, I'm sure you must have been critical with regard to both of them.
Yes, we were looking at it from a very ideological point of view, that you were all the Washington consensus. But what I'm curious about is that you started studying inequality at a time when it wasn't as common as it is today. Actually, how I remember it, people weren't talking that much about equality 20, 25 years ago. Why did you start studying inequality?
You know, it's actually, I started studying it, my dissertation in Yugoslavia, because I did my PhD in Belgrade, was Economic Inequality in Yugoslavia. It was published as a book in 1987. Now, the reason why I started studying is because in economics, in those days, I was fairly reasonably good in mathematics, and I started actually studying statistics. And then suddenly these two interests, as I mentioned to you, a more social interest and sort of Marxist kind of view of the world, combined with mathematics. And actually for the first time when I saw that people could actually draw the distribution curve, you know, log normal, you know, curve. And I saw it for the first time. And then I said, well, there was like all the toolkit which existed with it, which of course I was then discovering with Lorentz curve, Gini coefficient, tail coefficient, all of that. That was a revelation for me, because I suddenly said, well, you know, we can empirically study class relations and incomes of people. And that's something which has stayed with me forever, actually. I just want to mention, you mentioned very kindly capitalism alone, but really one of the, I think, main ideas behind capitalism alone is studying class structure and studying incomes of individuals empirically. So that was something that really, that's how it brought for me, these two things together. So that was the, the beginning of my interest. So it goes very, far back. Just one last thing is that actually I got to the World Bank because there were in the research department, because there were so few people in Eastern Europe who worked with household surveys and with income inequality and with such numbers. So there was probably 10 or 15 people in total.
So what do you think happened? It's obviously that some books came out. Thomas Piketty's book came out, and your own book was very, very influential when it came out. The book I mentioned before, Global Inequality. It seems also to me that something changed after the financial crisis, that inequalities were exposed to a more alarming extent. And now it's like inequality is something that people talk about in Davos even, and in governments all over the world. Why do you think that focus changed, apart from the fact that inequality had been decreasing for decades?
Yes, it's actually something changed, and I totally agree with you. The financial crisis was the big trigger. I think what changed is that until the financial crisis, there was this belief, particularly strong in the United States, that basically the middle class is growing, and that essentially you can borrow, even if it was well known that, of course, the median wage had been constant for 30 years. But women's participation rates went up, so household incomes went up on account of that, and then borrowing came in. And as you know, of course, people borrowed really for, basically with no income at all, were able to get housing. The Bush administration encouraged that by essentially letting people borrow any amount. And then eventually the crisis hit. And I think this was a big sobering experience, because people simply realized, look, first, my incomes did not grow as much as I thought, because I'm either borrowing on the credit card or I'm borrowing just simply to survive. And you see that in the United States very clearly today, just a parenthetical comment. You saw, for example, a couple of months ago, people in really fancy cars costing $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 waiting in line to get free meals. It's really, really bizarre to you when you think of this. So that's one thing. And the second thing which happened was that they realized, look at these guys at the very top, not only on top 1%, but top 5 or even top 10. They have had a very good time. So they actually are earning like 10 times more than we are, and we cannot pay our debt. And I think these two elements were actually made people realize something is not right. And at that point, really the knowledge which existed was basically kind of transferred actually, or became appreciated by individual people. And I think Piketty's book also played a big role in that, in making the consciousness of the, of inequality much greater.
Here on our newspaper, we've been writing about inequality for decades. There are a lot of issues we've been writing about for decades without hearing the applause yet. But I always thought that inequality was difficult conceptually, because inequality in itself is not a problem. If you have someone working 40 hours a week, you say, well, it's fair, they earn twice as much as someone working 20 hours a week. If you have Bernie Sanders selling a book about political revolution and he becomes a millionaire, you say, well, he spread ideas to a lot of people. Inequality between me and him, it's okay. But then there's a point where inequality becomes a problem, and then you have different kinds of inequality. So I've always thought that it was conceptually very difficult to go from the analysis of inequality to political mobilization. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because inequality, when you just mentioned inequality, it's a fairly amorphous thing. You don't know, like, what do you want to say by that? First of all, as you said, the justification of many inequalities is, ethically quite acceptable. Some people want to work harder. Also, there is a luck element, which comes in. Some people have sometimes a luck, some others don't. Some people invent things, other people don't. So there is no doubt that actually inequality per se has a good side. Actually, if anything, if I can go back to your original question, one of the problems in socialist countries was that actually there was not enough inequality. In other words, I remember my Czech friend, a sociologist, who actually studied the entire inequality in Czechoslovakia by saying it's demographically determined. So basically there was nothing for you to do. You just grow, get higher income and then lower income with pension, end of story. So that's obviously not good. But there are other, and then it is amorphous because sometimes people mean by inequality which is not justified between races, between genders, between people from different parts of the country, or even people globally between different parts of the world. And I'm sure we'll come to that in a minute. So it is a difficult concept. So when I say inequality went up, also you can say, well, how do you measure that? Is it actually, do you look at the share of the top 1% or top 10%? Do you look at the middle class share? Do you look at the ratio between the top and the bottom? You know, there are millions of ways to look at that. But I agree with you, there is a point which we cannot really pinpoint exactly, but there is certainly a point at which higher inequality becomes counterproductive because essentially people are able to benefit from their background, from their inheritance, from their connections. And they also, especially we can see that in the United States, and in Europe also, they actually try to make the rules of the game in their favor because they have money.
Yeah, I think basically our societies accept economic inequality, but we do not accept political inequality. Right. These two should go together, political equality and economic inequality. And it's very hard to pinpoint where that translates into political inequality as well. But then when your books came out, and there was another book by Walter Scheidel, I think it was called The Great Level, a book over, and that was absolutely the most pessimistic book. He just said there are only wars and pandemics and revolutions that can change inequality. In your book, you distinguish between benign and malign forces. The benign we know, especially in social democrat countries, because we talk about them all the time.
Right.
The malign forces are like revolutions, wars, pandemics. So when this pandemic hit, I was thinking, okay, our lives will be fucked up for the next half year. The poor will be hurt, but at least we'll get to deal with global inequality. I know that was not what you were saying, that they would inevitably lead to greater equality, but that was a chance. I thought it was a chance. And how do you think that COVID-19 and inequality has played out?
Let me say actually first where I agree and disagree with Walter Scheidel. Scheidel is a friend, and actually he's a phenomenal historian. We started correspondence because I was interested in Roman history and actually inequality in the Roman Empire. So, and then he worked also, he's an empirical person studying Roman Empire. I actually believe, as you mentioned, in global inequality, I divide forces into benign and malign. I think there is no doubt there are benign forces that can reduce inequality. You know, increase of level of education, better skills of the people, higher taxation of capital incomes, higher taxation on inheritance, higher role of trade unions, all the elements that actually people obviously in Denmark, in Nordic countries, and actually practically in all of Europe know quite well, which were behind the reduction of inequality after World War II. When it comes to malign elements, there, of course, it's kind of difficult. You know, I have to say that it is true that mass wars, like for example, World War I and World War II, in many cases reduced inequality. I mean, Piketty's book shows that very clearly. However, it shows that in the case of France, which had military actions on its own territory and large destruction of property and capital. It's not at all true for the United States that the World War I had an impact on inequality. Simply, there was no, physical war there. Similarly, when you look at more recent data that actually 2 papers recently came out, what was interesting to observe is that in the UK during World War I, inequality went down because essentially the government was able to make the rich people pay for the war, and they knew that unless the rich people pay, you would not be able to deliver food to people who actually had to fight and die for you. In Germany, very interestingly, and actually you see that in the data, there was an ability to make the landlords, the Junkers, and the rich people pay. And actually inequality in Germany went up. So what I want to say by that is that it's not universally the case that the warfare would lead to a reduction of inequality. Likewise for the epidemics. Lots of our thinking about the epidemics was really based on the Black Plague of the European 14th century. Well, that epidemic, as you know, killed 1/3 of the population. When it killed so many people, the scarcity of labor went up and wages went up. And actually, to some extent, the feudal institutions, which linked people to their fiefdoms, so to land, became much weaker because labor was more valuable. So, today's situation is very, very different, if I may say so. It's obviously we don't have 1/3 of the population dying, luckily. We also don't have labor that is actually linked to land. So, I don't think we can extrapolate from, 1350 to today.
But how has it, but now today, Davos, the World Economic Forum, I think is starting online today as an online event, just like you and me. And so we have all these Oxfam analyses that usually come out at this time of year, showing that inequality has increased enormously, that the rich have gotten a lot richer. And we hear every month about Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg getting richer. Is there anything specific about inequality increasing during COVID-19 that we should take notice of?
Yes, Oxfam comes every year with, of course, these alarmist reports. They are true, actually. But this year particularly true because this year obviously is very, previous year rather was very special. Now, what can we say, actually? On the one hand, there was this increase in top fortunes and an incredibly strong stock market in the United States, which is something we didn't expect at all, but which, of course, was the result of the incredible increase in liquidity, which is also unprecedented. We didn't have the situations that 20% of GDP is suddenly being injected. Many of the sort of nostrums of economics have to be reconsidered now. We have phenomenal increase in liquidity. On the other hand, prices have not moved. And okay, anyway, going back to inequality. So that happened actually at the very top of the income, or rather wealth distribution. On the other hand, it is also true, but we don't have the numbers yet. I would be very curious to see when the numbers come out, what the results are actually. We see also, on the other hand, that this injection of liquidity in Europe, in the United States, but also in Latin America, had often helped poor people. For example, we have some numbers in Brazil that show that actually people at the bottom decile got more money from the liquidity that was actually the government stimulus package than normally they would actually have under the normal conditions. So it is not totally obvious that inequality must have gone up in individual countries. I believe there are some elements for that because, of course, as we know, people who were so-called essential workers actually either lost job or had been threatened by job loss or work less and so on. But I think it's a very mixed picture within countries. So I cannot be entirely sure that inequality within countries went up. Angus Deaton recently had a paper about global inequality. He didn't deal with within country inequality, but his sort of prior was that there was an increase in within country inequality. So it is possible, but I cannot be 100% sure for that.
It is a point in global inequality that globalization is a very, very strong force. And I would guess that you're skeptical about those saying that globalization will be changed dramatically or that globalization will be even halted. But on the other hand, we do see that they're bringing home supply chains and that the global value chains are changing, that we see kind of a different globalization. How do you see this? Do you think we're seeing a dramatic shift in globalization or just small reforms?
It is a very good question. Let me say what is my current thinking on this. I think that globalization would not be much affected, not even by global value chains. And actually, if anything, we see there may be some return, some return of security goods. Like, for example, PPE equipment, people have realized that you cannot depend on only, foreign countries selling you that in the case of crisis. But as you see, actually, yesterday there was a report, the inflow of foreign investment in China is at historical peak. So, I don't think that global value chains would be much affected. Moreover, I believe that globalization of labor would become more important, as we can see it now with you and me discussing this. So if somebody, for example, were to pay me to do some work, like online, electronically, I can do that. And if I'm actually working from, like, suppose Burma or Laos, I can do it much more cheaply than somebody in Denmark. So I think actually that would accelerate globalization. What I'm worried, I have to say, is a political element, and that's the conflict between China and the United States, which I really see as the beginning of a new Cold War, which is, I think, absolutely unfortunate. And that, of course, can make a difference. So that could be that, you saw that in the US now having a law that you have to buy much more strict law about buying only American goods, but if you do that through the government contracts, and then there will be really an attempt to reduce Chinese ability to develop high technologies, advanced technologies. So that, I think, can actually make an influence on globalization.
It's a point it's a premise of capitalism alone that capitalism is the only game left in town. And there's a beautiful line that I must quote for all Marxists out there, saying that you say that we now see the realignment of the superstructure and the infrastructure of society. to put it in other words, that the hearts and minds of people and the basic economic structures are in a kind of harmony. And I think that's obvious, and that you're right about that. And the first consequence is that there is no alternative to capitalism. Right. But on the other hand, I have the sensation now that people are curious about a lot of different varieties of capitalism. That right. Bernie Sanders' socialism is a kind of capitalism as well. Piketty's participatory socialism is capitalism as well. So on the one hand, there is no alternatives outside capitalism, but you see a lot of alternatives inside capitalism, and that is kind of an ideological struggle now. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's true, actually. And even if I may say so, in the end of my book, I do actually allow for a possibility of change, And however, my sort of possibility of change is slightly different, because I see that it should be driven by two things. First, by the change in the proportion between different factors of production, and by the greater efficiency of the new system. If you look at historically, again, from very Marxist perspective, the triumph of capitalism was based on a greater efficiency of capitalism. It essentially was able to roll over the previous systems and to become more efficient. I see that, for example, you have Lincoln there on the top of behind you. And one of the reasons why Lincoln was so admired by Marx was precisely his ability to actually destroy basically slavery as a system, and to do it with a military force. Because basically what Lincoln did from Marx's perspective was destroy a system which was anyway less efficient, which was oppressive, and to use military force to do that. Now, I think actually if capital becomes in the next century much more plentiful, and labor, as we know, actually the total population probably in the world would stagnate at 10.5 or 11 billion. We could have a situation a little bit like today in startups, where capital is plentiful, but if you have a good idea, you put like 10 other people who actually have good ideas, you could actually borrow that capital. So that capitalists would then still remain capitalists, but they would not be managing the process of production. In other words, the workers, or actually people who had the idea, become managers. And that, of course, changes. You don't have hired labor anymore. And in that sense, I think capitalism would look like a different, it would no longer be the capitalism by strict definition. Now, in Piketty, his idea is, as you know, is to limit the voting rights of people who have capital, so that you cannot go over 10% of voting rights. So that also would, of course, would make capitalism today very different from what actually, that type of capitalism would be very different from capitalism today.
And that was there was a utopia in some Scandinavian countries by the labor unions in the 70s and 80s that you would essentially, instead of having wage increases, you'd have stakes in the company. So the workers would essentially become the capitalists and the owners. The thing is that the workers, they preferred wage increases than more holiday. So they didn't want to be capitalists. They wanted to be bourgeois. Another point here is that when there's this realignment between the ideology and the economic realities of society, between hearts and minds and how we live, then you see how strong the capitalist value system is, that this is how people want to realize themselves. And I was thinking of your book when I saw the inauguration of Joe Biden a week ago, and you saw these pop stars with their signs of wealth, their diamonds and their gold, and they would be celebrating a new era after 1 millionaire left the White House. And then sometimes I think, do we even have the imagination? Do we have sufficient imagination to challenge the basic assumptions of our ideology, a superstructure of society?
No, the ideology is like what Deng Xiaoping said, you know, to be rich is glorious. So, you know, these people that you mentioned, actually, they don't even see any contradiction in that. You know, they have so much absorbed the ethos of capitalism and wealth that they have totally, they don't realize what's the problem there at all. And, you know, to some extent, I have to blame the left, actually, because the left has become very sort of focused on things which are truly, of course, discriminatory, but they are not the end of the story. So in other words, I always like to give this example. If you have, and you do have now in most countries, a gender inequality that for the same work and same experience, women are paid less. You know, that used to be much worse. Now it's less, I mean, the gap is less. But let's suppose that you totally eliminated the gap. And I think maybe some Nordic countries are close to that, or maybe they have achieved that. You know, it could be that Denmark or Norway or Sweden or Finland have achieved that. That does not mean that you have eliminated inequality, because you can have the same distribution of wages among women that you have among men. And that's actually basically what happens. So your inequality can remain very high. So that's not the end of the story. That's simply a prerequisite towards doing more. And I think very often this is totally forgotten. And in my opinion, it is unfortunate that the left, particularly in the United States, has really become only obsessed with identities as if it were sufficient. And ideologically, as you mentioned, ideologically, people don't see any problem with that, because their structure of values is very much aligned with the structure of values that is that capitalism necessitates in order to grow. So really, profit making in the sphere of production is really reflected totally by this kind of a dictum of becoming rich is glorious, and there is no contradiction between these two.
And maybe that also explains why the global euphoria of Bernie Sanders not being a part of this. He's wearing his own dress. There's one little socialist from another era sitting outside this theater of wealth. Well, I'm jumping a little because I have so many questions that I'd love to ask you. When I was growing up in the 90s, I think we shared the presumption that you mentioned before, that capitalism would lead to democracy. And we were saying, well, never mind China, their dictatorship for now. But as soon as they get market reforms, as soon as they experience the delights of capitalism, they will have a middle class. And a middle class in China won't the same as a middle class here with us. So we were, and you know, up till 10 years ago, everyone was encouraging, from a democratical perspective, growth in China, saying, well, never mind, it doesn't look too good for now. But communism is over. They'll end up like us. They want the Danish TV shows and the American TV shows and Jennifer Lopez, and then they want political rights. After that, it turned out actually that they developed their own kind of capitalism. And now we see that they have a power over us. So even basketball stars in America, politicians in Denmark are afraid to speak out their mind. This is one very, very brilliant part of capitalism alone, is the way you contrast the political capitalism of China and the liberal meritocratic capitalism of the West. How do you see the strength between these two systems of capitalism that we have now and that have shattered the illusions of my childhood?
Well, let me put it like that, which I think it is something which is inbuilt in what we just were saying about capitalism being so successful by creating this internal ethos that we have of desire for greater wealth. It has been so successful, but potentially it has led to the problems that you explained for the following reason. If we can imagine that the Chinese type of capitalism, or political capitalism, spreads to a few other countries, and actually there are many reasons I didn't mention them because within the discussion in my book, for example, Russia was not discussed because I discussed the political capitalism in countries that were colonized and had to be liberated from Western colonizers. So Russia did not fit there, but I didn't discuss Russia. But Russia has a political capitalism as well. There are other countries that have it. You know, I mentioned in the book countries like Vietnam, Laos, Burma, Angola, Algeria, Ethiopia, and so forth. You can even argue that in Europe, for example, I think that actually Serbia, my own country, is close to political capitalism. Hungary is somewhat close. Turkey is very close. So then the question becomes the following. Let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, that such countries, through technocratic management, and they might have multi-party systems, which really don't matter, they are able to actually grow faster. If they grow faster, that desire for wealth, which is inbuilt in us, would actually lead us to espouse the system which is economically more efficient. So if one day people from China are much richer than Europeans, come to Europe as they are coming now, and they would actually come in greater numbers, they show that they are richer, they buy houses, they have better, whatever it is, cars or airplanes in those days, we would actually tend to take that system because we see the advantages of that system. So that was also, in my own opinion, one of the reasons for the fall of communism was inability to economically compete with capitalism. So if the liberal capitalism falls behind political capitalism economically, there would be a desire among people because precisely of this ethos of money making that we have to emulate political capitalism. So really I see that the race between the two of them as being economic race between the two of them.
But you also, in the book, you actually, because it's a very strong juxtaposition. And I grew up in the West knowing that we would always be superior. And as a leftist, you regretted it, but you knew that was how it would be. So when I was reading your book, I was saying, well, they're almost equal here. But then in the end, you say, actually, there are some advantages to democratic capitalism. What are they?
Yeah,
from
there are
a functional economic perspective.
You know, I have to make very clear my opinion, for example, on democracy. I see democracy essentially as a tool. Many people see democracy as a value in itself. I think there is something which is true to that. But I also think that people, because of the reasons that I just explained, that people are willing to trade off parts of democracy or freedom in order to achieve greater income or wealth. So I see democracy then as being a tool. Now that tool can be very efficient for many reasons that are again known, is that actually if you make huge mistakes in democracy by selecting a wrong candidate or having wrong policy, you can actually adjust that because simply you have a means, people have a means to adjust that by selecting different types of policies. I'm not only talking about Trump now, I'm just talking, for example, if you overtax somebody or part of the population, and then you realize that's actually bad for economic growth, the next period, when you have the elections, you can reduce taxation and actually improve things. Or the opposite, you might have too low taxes and you want to increase taxes. In an authoritarian system, it is much more difficult. Once you have a setup there, you really do not have this feedback function from people to the rulers, which is as clear as in the case of democracy. So that was one of the reasons that I see that democracy has an advantage. And there are some studies that show, for example, that the level of economic outcomes in democracy is much more restricted in the sense that countries are not so much different in terms of level of economic growth rate. compared to authoritarian systems where you can actually end up with China, but you can also be a Congo, you know, so because there is no feedback. So that was, in my opinion, one of the big advantages of democracy in generating stable economic growth.
I have one last question for you, Branko. I actually have 1,000 questions for you.
Yeah, no, Rune, we could go on.
But I only have time for one. In the book, Capitalism Alone, you say that capitalism has now invaded all spheres of life. Right. So capitalism has expanded. So now our privacy, our leisure, Airbnb, Uber, everything is capitalism. Yep. But I have, and of course that is correct. And you see with the tech giants that our data, the way we breathe, our heartbeats, everything is capitalism. But I have the sensation that it's not just capitalism invading other spheres of life. They are invading capitalism as well. So that within a business like our company, you have to say, how are people feeling psychologically? How are they feeling emotionally? And that is not just enhancing their performance. That is also a kind of humanizing of capitalism at the same time. Or you could say, we have Amazon, this fucked up bookstore that's conquering the whole world. And no matter what goes wrong, they'll just get richer and richer. And he even owns the Washington Post now. What a disgrace to the free world. But at the same time, Amazon, it's a place where I can read your book. We translate it, we put it out to. So there are always forces released by capitalism that are not capitalist and that will counter capitalist on all levels. What do you think of that criticism?
Let me just say on Amazon that of course I agree with you. I was actually thinking recently when I was looking at my statement, credit card statement. I said, well, really, because he lives in Washington, the owner, Jeff Bezos, I really should not be paying my statement anymore. I should just take a check and bring it over to him, to his house, walk over to his house and give it to him. Because practically everything on my credit statement was Amazon. Food, books, buying socks, everything is Amazon. So that's quite extraordinary, the power. And then, of course, another thing is, of course, the power that they have now in the media. For example, the Atlantic magazine is also owned by one of the richest people in the world. So basically, they have spread into the media, and it finds no sort of, there is no fighting back against that. But that humanization of capitalism is a good point, and I agree that actually in many cases that's the case. But I'm really skeptical about. We almost will going to sound like Davos. In this Davos talks about stakeholders and how they really love their workers and all of that. I think it's, yes, up to a certain point. But when it becomes a choice between making more money for shareholders or yourself and giving more money to workers, of course, you decide to do the job of the shareholders. So I'm not really convinced by that. I agree that there is certain, there was obviously some improvements. Obviously, we are not the 19th century today, but I do believe that eventually Friedman was right, is that essentially the role of the capitalist enterprise is to make money for the shareholders, and they would do this stakeholder stuff as long as it actually is good for their business, but not the point further.
Well, thank you so very, very much for answering all the questions and for your books and your work. You're great inspiration for us, and you make our journalism better and our lives more fun, at least. Thank you very much, Branko.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure, and I hope to actually see you in vivo so that we can actually have this conversation in Copenhagen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.